The average life expectancy of humans is approximately 70 years. This means that, like other animals, we are born, grow into adults, age, and eventually die. But one thing that makes humans different from other creatures is our consciousness. We are able to process, understand, and reflect on everything happening around us. We can think about what is happening and why. And because of this consciousness, humans have achieved so much. We have invented numerous technologies, found cures for most diseases, traveled to the moon, landed a rover on Mars, and even sent a spacecraft from Earth 23 billion kilometers into space. Every day, we keep making new technological advancements. Other creatures might not know much about us, but we know everything about them. But have you ever used your own consciousness to step back from the rush of life and think about where we, humans, came from? I mean, think about your parents, their parents, and so on. If you go further back, who was the very first human, and where did they come from? Have you ever thought about this? Of course, this question must have crossed your mind at some point, and this very question was causing a lot of noise in the mind of a man named Charles Darwin. And then came that day when Charles Darwin found the answer to this question. Where do humans come from? Who was the first human? And where did all the plants, animals, and creatures come from? The answer was evolution. After years of research, in 1859, Charles Darwin published a book titled On the Origin of Species, in which he discussed the theory of evolution by natural selection. He explained that humans, plants, animals, and all other living creatures evolved from a single organism over time. But to understand which organism that was, and where it came from, we need to go back in time, about 4 billion years ago. But before we start with the origin of evolution, let me explain the meaning of evolution by natural selection, how evolution works. Look, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution says that evolution happens through natural selection. Now, how does natural selection work? Imagine there is a desert area where some beetles live. The sand in the desert is brown, and the beetles are also brown in color. Because of this, they blend into the desert sand and can easily disguise themselves, which makes it hard for predators to spot them. But suddenly, due to pollution or some other reason, the desert sand turns white, and now the brown beetles become visible against the white background, making them easy targets for predators. However, due to a genetic mutation, some beetles started turning white. This new color gave them better camouflage in the changed environment, which helped them survive better. The white beetles could now hide more easily in the sand and were more likely to survive, leading to an increase in their population. Over time, the brown beetles became extinct, and the white beetles emerged. This is how the theory of natural selection works. A term often used here is survival of the fittest, which means that the species that adapts best to nature and its environment will survive in the long term. In short, the species that can adapt to changing nature will survive, while nature will eliminate those that cannot. So, up to this point, you've understood the basic concept of evolution. Now let's go back 4 billion years and find out how life began and where humans came from. 4 billion years ago, the Earth was covered with water everywhere. When the oceans on Earth formed, they created a kind of soup filled with organic compounds. These organic compounds were simple chemicals like carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, and oxygen. These molecules were going to become the basic building blocks of life. In this primordial soup, chemical reactions were happening. With the combination of solar energy, lightning, and volcanic activity, these simple molecules began reacting and forming more complex molecules, such as amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. These molecules continued to react with each other and gradually formed even more complex structures, like proteins and RNA molecules. RNA, which is still essential for transferring our genetic material today, may have first emerged from this primordial soup. Now, the molecules I just mentioned in the primordial soup formed some that could make copies of themselves. These molecules were not like the reproduction we see in living organisms. They could only replicate themselves, creating more molecules like them at that time. These molecules were called self-replicating molecules, and they played a crucial role in the formation of proto-life. Proto-life refers to the early stages of life. RNA molecules probably did this work first. When one molecule makes a copy of itself, it means it can pass on information, and this is a basic characteristic of life. These RNA molecules began to gather in small compartments formed by fatty acid layers. We can call these primitive cell-like structures. These compartments helped keep the molecules together, where they could interact and become more complex. These cell-like compartments floated in the oceans, similar to soap bubbles, and these primitive cells marked the first stage in the beginning of proto-life. Gradually, these primitive cells acquired new features, like storing and using energy and adapting to their environment. These features helped the cells survive. As time passed, these proto-cells continued to evolve, eventually transforming into more complex life forms. From these proto-life cells, a stage came where evolution had developed so much that they now had specific genetic codes, which they began passing on to each new generation. This genetic code is what we call DNA today, and back then, this code was more stable in the form of DNA, making these cells more complex and efficient. Now, these cells carried universal information that would continue in every future generation. With this universal genetic information, the first universal common ancestor, FUCA, was born. FUCA was an organism that could store genetic information and make copies of itself, forming the base of all current life forms' genetic code. It wasn't just a single organism, but a group of organisms that shared similar properties. These cells could replicate, make basic proteins, and use energy, things they needed to survive. Around 3.8 billion years ago, the evolution of FUCA led to the birth of two unicellular organisms. The first were the ancient cells, and the second was LUCA, last universal common ancestor, which evolved from FUCA. The ancient cells quickly became extinct because they could only evolve in harsh conditions, and their structure was very simple. These cells lacked the ability to form complex relationships like modern cells do, and they couldn't adapt to changing conditions. You might remember the example I gave earlier. Only those that adapt to the conditions survive. Since they couldn't adapt, these cells became extinct. On the other hand, LUCA, which had a much more complex structure, was able to evolve in all conditions. It had the ability to form complex relationships within its cells, just like modern cells. LUCA was a unicellular organism that served as the common ancestor of all modern life forms. You can say that it was our first common ancestor because it is the shared ancestor of all living things, whether plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, or anything else. Now, moving on in the video, by the time of LUCA, life had developed a basic structure capable of replication, meaning it could make copies of itself. The goal of this replication was simple: survival. However, when LUCA started cell division, it led to an increase in the cell population. This cell division happened through simple binary fission, where a single cell divides into two identical cells. This process of division was crucial because it gave the new generation a chance to adjust to new environments. As different cells began to survive in new environments, genetic mutations started to occur, which is the core mechanism of evolution. Thus, when LUCA's descendants spread into new environments, two distinct groups began to evolve: bacteria and archaea. They both originated from the same ancestor, but their evolution took different directions. Bacteria. Their evolution was marked by a simple structure. Bacterial cells did not have a nucleus, but they could survive in simple environments like soil, water, and even extreme temperatures. Archaea. Compared to bacteria, archaea learned to survive in extreme environments like the deep sea, highly acidic or salty regions. Their cell membranes were slightly different from those of bacteria, which provided them stability in extreme conditions. Archaea developed some metabolic pathways that were different from those in bacteria, which allowed them to explore new survival strategies. Then, about 1.6 to 2.1 billion years ago, when bacteria and archaea were thriving in their respective environments, another evolutionary leap occurred: the evolution of eukaryotes. This evolution was a result of symbiosis, which is a biological process where one organism lives inside another, benefiting both. As a result, bacteria started living inside host cells, teaching them to generate energy, which eventually led to the formation of mitochondria. This process, known as endosymbiosis, began billions of years ago. The evolution of multicellular organisms was furthered by this endosymbiosis process. As this evolution progressed, some organisms began to develop a new structure: the vertebral column. The vertebral column, or backbone, represented a major evolutionary leap, allowing vertebrates, animals with a backbone, to evolve. Earlier organisms were simple and soft-bodied, like some worm-like creatures, but gradually they began to develop a support system. One theory suggests that some organisms initially developed a notochord, a flexible rod-like structure that provided support and stability. Over time, the notochord began to evolve into the vertebral column. The vertebral column gave these animals an advantage: increased mobility and stability, allowing them to adapt to new environments. These organisms can be considered proto-fish. As time progressed, the first proper fish evolved from these proto-fish. These proto-fish were simple creatures, but they were undergoing important adaptations that would eventually turn them into fish. As the vertebral column developed, these proto-fish gained a strong base for muscles to attach to, enabling them to move easily through water. During this time, they also began developing fins, which were essential for movement and control. This led to the evolution of the first fish, known as agnatha, jawless fish. These primitive fish lacked jaws, meaning the the first fish had no mouth, but with the vertebral column and fins, they could swim efficiently in water. However, 538 million years ago, the Cambrian Explosion took place, a geological period during which life forms diversified rapidly. During this time, many new phyla of organisms appeared on Earth. This sudden diversification led to the emergence of jawless fish, like Agnatha, developing jaws. One theory suggests that some unknown hunting species began preying on jawless fish, which led to the evolution of jaws in Agnatha. Once jaws developed, these fish became better hunters and were able to diversify their diet. After jawless fish, about 440 million years ago during the Devonian period, placoderms, a type of fish with jaws, evolved. These jawed vertebrates were more powerful and adaptable. Some of these fish species looked like this. Placoderm fish evolved into 6 other species: Acanthothoraci, Rhenonida, Antiarche, Pedalichthyde, Tectodontida, and Arthrodira. Some of these species were only a few inches long, while others, like giant placoderms, grew up to 20 feet. Arthrodira was the most common group. They had a strong body structure and powerful jaws. One famous species within this group, Dunkleosteus, was known for its large jaws and size. Its normal size ranged from 11 to 13 feet, but some scientists estimate it could have been as large as 33 feet. Dunkleosteus, being large and powerful, began hunting smaller or weaker fish. To escape from these predators, the smaller placoderms would hide near the sea surface, but once on land, they couldn't move as quickly, requiring them to stay there for longer periods. Over time, these fish evolved 2 extra fins, allowing them to move more easily across the sea surface. At this stage, it's important to remember that all these species were still aquatic. No life form had yet appeared on the Earth's surface. At the same time, plants were also evolving, but that's a separate topic we won't cover in this video. We may make a separate video about it in the future. Now, going back to our story, the small species of placoderm fish continued to evolve. Over time, their jaws became stronger, and the 2 additional fins began to evolve further, making them even more powerful. So, the evolution of tetrapods, specifically a group of them known as lobe-finned fishes, leads to the emergence of a very special creature, Tiktaalik rosy. This creature slowly developed qualities that allowed it to survive both on land and in water. Tetrapods, which are animals with 4 pairs of limbs, are what we call tetrapoda. What probably happened is that during the Devonian period, also known as the Age of Fish, Tiktaalik rosy first came to the Earth's surface. Because its skull was shaped in such a way that it could bite and eat food, it began to survive on land by finding a food source. It's important to remember that evolution is not a process that moves in one direction, but rather in every possible direction. Only those species that can survive thrive, while the others perish. Since we're talking about the evolution of humans, I'm focusing only on the species that eventually led to humans. Returning to Tiktaalik rosy, when it first came to land, it couldn't walk properly. It used its fins to drag itself along. But through this process, it gradually learned to balance its body. It also had primitive lungs, which helped it breathe air outside the water. Tiktaalik rosy looked something like this, with a flat head and eyes positioned upward. This helped it hunt insects on the surface. That's why, among the thousands of fish species that came out of the sea, some went back into the water and some went extinct, but Tiktaalik managed to survive. However, living on land meant it had to deal with sunlight, which was challenging for it, but over millions of years, it evolved, developing skin that could protect it from sunlight. Its fins eventually turned into hard hands, allowing it to walk and run faster on land. It then evolved further into amphibians. Amphibians are vertebrates that live through 2 stages of their life cycle, first in water, then on land, like frogs and salamanders. After evolving into amphibians, they reproduced, and their offspring evolved into reptiles like turtles, snakes, lizards, and crocodiles. One specific group of reptiles called archosaurs was among them. These reptiles evolved and later gave rise to dinosaurs. The evolution of dinosaurs is an interesting story that we'll cover in more detail in another video. After the dinosaurs went extinct, the Cenozoic era began, around 65 million years ago. When the asteroid impact occurred and the climate drastically changed, not only did dinosaurs go extinct, but many other species did as well. After this event, the surviving species adapted to the new environment, and their evolution took new forms. Following this mass extinction, mammals experienced rapid growth. The smaller, underground mammals suddenly had access to new ecosystems that were ideal for them. These mammals were mostly insectivores, and they remained small in size. But as the Cenozoic era progressed, mammals began to diversify. As I mentioned before, tetrapods evolved into 4 major branches: amphibians, reptiles, marsupials, and eutherians. Amphibians and reptiles have already been explained, so let's talk about marsupials. Marsupials are a unique group of mammals known for their pouch, where their babies develop after birth. The evolution of marsupials began about 160 million years ago during the Jurassic period. At this time, there was a large continent called Gondwana, which included what is now South America, Africa, Australia, Antarctica, and India. Over time, Gondwana began to break apart, an event that is significant in understanding human evolution. As Gondwana split, South America and Australia drifted apart, and this separation caused marsupials to evolve differently on each continent. In South America, marsupials could not compete with other animals and nearly went extinct, evolving into the Virginia opossum. On the other hand, in Australia, marsupials faced no competition and evolved into species like kangaroos, koalas, wombats, and Tasmanian devils. The fourth branch of tetrapods was eutherians. These are mammals that use a placenta to allow their babies to develop fully inside the womb. The evolution of eutherians led to species like whales, bats, and herbivorous mammals like horses, elephants, and rodents. But you might be wondering, where do humans come in? Well, about 65 million years ago, after the dinosaurs went extinct, small mammals, which were mainly nocturnal, began to adjust to the new environment. These mammals lived in trees, and from them, the first primates evolved. Primates are small animals that live in trees, with flexible hands and feet and excellent vision, which help them move easily in the trees. Over time, primates evolved into two major groups, prosimians, like lemurs, and anthropoids, which include monkeys and apes. The story gets even more interesting here. Among anthropoids, some primates adapted differently, eventually leading to Old World monkeys in Asia and Africa, and New World monkeys in South America. This is where the evolution of humans begins. Apes, the larger primates, were more powerful and intelligent, and their brain sizes began to grow. They lacked tails, a characteristic linked to a specific gene called TBXT. This group includes gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and orangutans, all of whom are our ancestors. Around 25 million years ago, during the Miocene period, apes evolved in Africa. During this period, Africa had dense forests that were so large and thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. But between 23 and 5 million years ago, tectonic plates shifted, and the Indian subcontinent collided with Asia, forming the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau. The formation of these mountains affected global wind patterns and ocean currents, impacting the entire world's climate. Before this tectonic collision, Earth's climate was much warmer. However, the climate began cooling, which created favorable conditions for the survival of primates. At the same time, the levels of carbon dioxide, CO2, began to drop, reducing the greenhouse effect and cooling the planet further. This led to a dry and cold climate, and large, dense forests shrank, giving way to grasslands and open land. Due to climate change, the trees that once existed have now become shorter, which forced some primates to come down to the ground. Over time, some apes began spending more time on the ground. These were called hominins because they were creatures with both human and ape characteristics. They had some human-like traits and some ape-like traits, and they were partially bipedal, meaning they could walk on two legs, but still had some features similar to monkeys and apes. The first ancestors of humans to evolve from the ape group were the hominins called Australopithecus, who lived in Africa around 4 million years ago. They were committed bipeds, meaning they walked on two legs just like us, and they used naturally sharp stones to hunt small animals and gather fruits for food. But the first species to actually begin using sharpened stones for tools was Homo habilis. Homo habilis evolved from Australopithecus. The name Homo habilis means handyman. Their brain size was larger than that of Australopithecus, around 510 to 600 cubic centimeters, which allowed them to think more complexly and make tools. Their hands and fingers were designed in such a way that they could grip and craft tools. They made simple tools called Oldowan tools, which included flakes and choppers used for cutting and scraping. They didn't hunt much on their own. They survived by eating leftover meat, like the remains of animals killed by predators, such as lions. They lived from about 2.1 to 1.4 million years ago. As time passed, Homo habilis evolved, and a new species emerged, Homo erectus, which existed from about 1.9 million to 110,000 years ago. It's still debated whether Homo erectus evolved from Homo habilis or if both species evolved from a common ancestor, because fossil evidence shows they lived together for about 500,000 years in East Africa. Homo erectus had adaptations that helped them survive for a longer period. Their brain size was significantly larger, averaging just under 1,000 cubic centimeters, enhancing their cognitive abilities. Their body structure was also more human-like, with long legs and short arms, which helped them walk efficiently on two legs. Homo erectus used more advanced tools and might have been the first species to control fire, as evidenced by the discovery of ash and burned animal bones in South Africa's Wonderwork Cave, which are about 1 million years old. This suggests that Homo erectus might have used fire for warmth, protection, and cooking, though it's still unclear how they learned to control fire, since no direct evidence of fire-making tools has been found. Homo erectus was the first species to spread from northeastern Africa and the Middle East, areas now mostly covered by deserts, into Europe and Asia. By this time, they had learned to make axes from stone, which were likely used for hunting large animals and cutting meat from bones. Despite their advantages, Homo erectus eventually became extinct, surviving until about 108,000 to 117,000 years ago. Their last known population was in Java, Indonesia. Next in the evolutionary sequence came Homo sapien, modern humans, who evolved from Homo erectus about 300,000 years ago. By this time, their brain size had increased to around 1,350 cubic centimeters, enabling better planning and problem-solving skills, which helped them move from hunting and gathering to farming and settling in one place. They used their intelligence to create new tools and understand complex systems. Early humans lived in small, mobile groups, meaning they didn't stay in one place but moved from location to location. This mobility helped them spread across the globe. Over time, humans developed a form of communication, and with their problem-solving skills, they invented technologies and eventually discovered their origins. Today, a Homo sapiens is talking about the origins of humans, while other Homo sapiens, like you, the viewer, are listening. As I mentioned in my previous video, evolution doesn't happen in a single direction. It happens in every possible direction. That's why you see so many species of animals. For example, there are currently 17,500 species of butterflies alive today. Similarly, there were 8 species of early humans, which you can see listed on the screen. But for various reasons, all except Homo sapiens became extinct. We are the only surviving species of the early human lineage. Now, people often ask, if we evolved from monkeys and apes, why didn't today's monkeys evolve into humans? The answer is that humans did not evolve from today's chimpanzees or other great apes, like gorillas and orangutans. We and these species share a common ancestor that lived around 10 million years ago. This means humans and chimpanzees have been evolving along separate paths. Another common question is whether evolution has stopped in humans. The answer is no. Evolution never stops. It's a slow process that always continues in every species. A good example of evolution in Homo sapiens is the change in skin color. Early humans in Africa had dark skin rich in melanin to protect them from intense UV radiation, which could damage DNA. But as humans migrated to regions with less sunlight, such as areas further from the equator, lighter skin developed to help with vitamin D synthesis in low sun environments. Evolution is still happening, and another example is the discovery of at least 18,000 new species every year. Many of these are species that were evolving for millions of years and have now become new species. So, this was the story of the origin of humans and all living things. It's difficult to predict how humans will look millions or billions of years from now, but one thing is certain: every creature, every human is special. So, don't focus too much on others. Think about yourself, because you are the one who has the ability to think.